Good people, welcome to the latest episode of Jonathan Thinks. I am Jonathan Collins, your host and friendly neighborhood democracy scholar, coming to you live from New York City, Harlem to be exact. I got a few things on my mind, and maybe, just maybe, you've been thinking about them too. First thing on my mind is this story about Chili. So if you haven't been following, Chili from TLC, actually one of my favorite R&B groups of all times. Chili from TLC is doing damage control after public records show that what appeared to be a donation to the Trump 2024 campaign. Now, she jumped on Instagram to make one thing clear. She is not MAGA. Her explanation claims that she didn't read the fine print and she was donating to anti-trafficking and veterans causes. So whether you believe it or not, it's a reminder that, hey, you should always know where your money is going. And if you're less skeptical, like I am, it's a reminder of something that is becoming a theme on this show, which is we have to hold celebrities accountable. We have to hold celebrities accountable. If Chili is even secretly a Republican Party supporter during this Trump era, if she even clandestinely agrees with Trump's policy proposals and platform, we got a problem. We got a problem. Here's my thing about why it's important. We know it's important to hold elected officials accountable. We talk about that constantly. You better hold them accountable. You better hold them accountable. You better vote. You better vote. You better vote. Celebrities who have a significant amount of influence when it comes to politics and elections, when they so choose to use that influence, and because they make so much money, as we're seeing with Chile, the ability to donate to campaigns and also influence elections that more traditional way, they have a lot of power. And with that power comes responsibility. In the same way that we are supposed to hold our elected officials accountable by voting, these celebrities, hey, we pay taxes, right? And therefore, our tax dollars demand that we have the right to hold public officials accountable. You know what we also pay? A lot of money that ultimately goes to celebrities. So, hey, the money that you're paying for those streaming services, the money that you're paying for Spotify and Apple Music, the money that you're paying for CDs, albums, records, concert tickets, merch, right? We are footing the bill for celebrities who go off and apparently sometimes donate to campaigns that have zero interest in our livelihood, in our humanity, and our dignity. Chile donated to a campaign, the 2024 campaign, not the 2016 campaign. She donated to the 2024 campaign that was all about Project 2020, making arguments that Black people don't deserve financial opportunity, economic opportunity, that the border need to be secured, and that one of the top priorities should be exercising state sanctioned violence against brown folks who we target and racialize as violent immigrants. That's what Chile was supporting, hopefully unknowingly. But if there's even a chance she was conscious of what she was doing, that's a big problem. And again, these celebrities need to be held accountable. Hold them to the same standard that we would expect the politicians to be held to, because again, they have influence. And that influence needs to be working for us, not against us. Another thing that I'm thinking about, speaking of celebrities misusing their influence, Nick Cannon also went viral recently for making some pretty inflammatory statements. So Nick Cannon, he's in hot water this week after calling the Democratic Party the party of the KKK on his web talk show, while also expressing support for Donald Trump. Nick Cannon also made comments during a conversation with Amber Rose claiming that, quote, Democrats don't care about people of color. And he was also pointing to the party's dark history, claiming that Democrats don't care about people of color. Now, a lot of people have jumped on this and have been killing Nick Cannon for what is really just a series of ignorant statements. I don't think Nick Cannon is an ignorant person, but I do think that these were ignorant statements. Because if you know some of the kind of basic fundamental history of American politics, especially over the 20th century, you know about the Southern strategy and party realignment. And basically starting around the 1920s, but really kicking up in the 1940s, you started to see this party realignment over civil rights, where yes, what is now the Democratic Party used to actually be the party of segregation. And then what is now the Republican Party, it was the party of Abraham Lincoln, the party that was advancing for slave abolition. It was the Union Army. It was the faction of the United States that wanted to abolish slavery. And then we started to see during the 20th century racial realignment where the parties switched on segregation. 1940, Harry Truman became the first major Democratic figure to express support for civil rights. This followed by the 1948 Democratic Party convention, where the party as a whole just came out and said, look, we are going to establish this plank where we are not going to sign off on segregation and racism anymore. We are moving the party away from racism and we are focusing on more national unity. And as a result, the Democratic Party then started to dominate elections. And so the Republican Party, seeing that they were now starting to lose presidential elections, they were struggling to compete nationally, you started to see what has now become the Goldwater strategy, 1964, where Barry Goldwater, who is kind of the whisperer for Ronald Reagan, came up with the execution of the Southern strategy, where now suddenly the Republican Party started using these buzzwords to signal to Southern segregationists that they were on board. You know, suddenly they started talking about states' rights. They started talking about law and order. They started talking about an opposition to forced busing, welfare resentment, crime, and the protection of quote unquote traditional values. These were dog whistles that attracted Southern segregationists into the Republican Party. And here we are now. So yes, Nick Cannon is correct in that the Democratic Party of old was the party of the politics of the KKK. The thing we have to remember here is that political parties don't work that way, though. Political parties don't have some innate identity. Political parties are literally just these organizations that are designed to be used by groups with their own ideologies and politics to win elections. That's the point of a political party, to win elections and to govern and to influence public policy. That's it. There's nothing inherently racist about it. There's nothing inherently sexist about it. But what happens is when groups that advocate for racist ideas and racist policies, sexist ideas, sexist policies, when they can come together and form a political coalition and use that coalition, influence a political party, and they can then compete in a national election, that's when we have a political party that becomes a problem. And ironically, the things that Barry Goldwater during this Southern strategy was saying about the Republican Party to make that shift in the 1960s are very similar today. So Barry Goldwater, just real quick on this, Barry Goldwater's main argument against civil rights is that the federal government has no business regulating or influencing how private companies can go about hiring. So he claims, I have no issue with anti-discrimination and civil rights. I just don't think that the federal government should be influencing companies as they go about the process of desegregating. Does that sound familiar? What Trump's strategy is doing is actually a step further than the Goldwater strategy, because Goldwater was just saying the federal government should not be used to advance diversity. The Trump administration is saying we are going to sue and restrict resources from companies, organizations, colleges, and universities that we find engaging in any kind of support for diversity. This is an even further extreme version of the Goldwater strategy. And that is what Nick Cannon is expressing support for. Again, this is why we have to hold these celebrities accountable, especially when it comes to politics. This ain't a game. This is people's livelihood. This is thousands and thousands of Black women are suddenly out of work, literally as soon as Trump takes office and starts making decisions. This is colleges and universities slashing their Black enrollment in predominantly white serving institutions. This is a burgeoning financial crisis with stagnating inflation that is hurting Black families at a disproportionate rate. These Trump policies are literally setting Black families back years in real time. And so the idea of just supporting Trump and making these half-baked criticisms of what the Democratic Party was and has been, it's useless. You have a critique of the Democratic Party, that's fine. We should be critiquing the Democratic Party. We should be questioning right now, where is the Democratic Party as these Trump policies continue to decimate the Black community? That's what we should be talking about. What we shouldn't be doing is justifying anything that's happening right now with the Republican Party. In fact, we should be figuring out, because, this makes me think about the 2016 election. And it was such a critical moment because, after 2 terms of Barack Obama, to me, the biggest source of potential optimism there was that it showed that we could have presidential elections where pushing a campaign focused on racism was not going to work. If a Black man could be elected president of the United States, that means that we can have a rainbow coalition of folks who agree that the segregationists and the deep racists are on the outside, and that any winning coalition should at least have to have neutral, if not positive, racial politics. That's how it felt, or that was the potential of where we were heading into 2016. And then Trump runs and allows for a campaign that invites the racist appeals back into the fold. And we had a choice to make. We could say, you know what? That's not a viable way to win elections. The only way you're going to win elections as the Republican Party is going to be focused on things like lower taxes and smaller government. You want to do that? Okay, fine. But the racism has to be kept off the table. Well, we fast forward, and that's not what happened. If anything, the racism got louder and louder and louder and stronger, and actually became the building blocks for a new political coalition that has been now successful in 2 of the last 3 presidential elections. Nick Cannon, that's what we should be concerned about. That's what we should be talking about. The fact that we can't have a presidential election now without racism being left off the table. And speaking of the Trump administration and DEI and anti-DEI, something else that I'm thinking about is this story about Pam Bondi. Attorney General Pam Bondi has been fired. Trump axed his own pick to lead the Justice Department, the same loyalist he tapped after Matt Gaetz's nomination fell through. And she's not alone. This makes her the second cabinet member who has been shown the door, following Kristi Noem's exit from Homeland Security last month. In both cases, the loyalists were women replaced by men. Both were not flat out fired, but they were conveniently reassigned. And on the surface, it looks like, well, there's a revolving door within the Trump administration. But a step deeper, you start to see that this commitment to a lack of diversity in the Trump administration is real, and it gets deeper and deeper and deeper. And so we're shaping out to have a cabinet of purely white men in 2026. Think about that. Look at where we are as a country. Bans on DEI, executive orders calling for the banning of DEI, a witch hunt, basically, for companies, organizations, colleges, and universities that employ people of color. But even within his own administration, you're seeing him weed out white women. This is the exact opposite of the Rainbow Coalition that we were building in 2008, 2012, on into 2016. Again, remember, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote. She received 3 million more votes than Donald Trump in 2016. I know, Electoral College, I get it, but I'm just saying, the more popular approach, the more popular politics were at that point on the Democratic Party side. And these were the politics of multiculturalism. These were the politics of, hey, let's keep the racism to the side and let's focus on a national agenda that is embracing globalism, thinking about the future of economy, and also thinking about the protection of Americans and ensuring things like healthcare, things like anti-poverty initiatives. We were thinking about education reform in meaningful ways, right? Like, there were things happening that are completely off the table now. And this Pam Bondi firing just shows you just how deep this thing is getting. Trump wants an administration that is full of nothing but all white men. That is the view of leadership. That is his view of competence. That is his view of what America should be and how it should look. And if that doesn't upset us, if that doesn't light a fire under us, that's a real problem. If that doesn't make us look at these celebrities like a Nick Cannon, like a Chili, who are supporting him openly or quietly, that's a big problem. That's a big problem. And lastly, speaking of big problems, I took particular issue with this story about LeBron. LeBron was on a YouTube show called Bob Does Sports. And while playing golf, he makes comments about Memphis, Tennessee. Yeah. So he's asked about, I guess, the places in the NBA that he least likes to travel to, or, just some of the downsides of being in the NBA. And he mentioned having to go to Milwaukee, I think on a Tuesday night. And he says in particular about Memphis that he don't want to go to Memphis on some random Thursday, that if Memphis had drafted him, he would have pulled an Eli Manning, because there's no way he was going to Memphis, even if he had been drafted by the team, and that they should move the team from Memphis to Nashville. And of course, people have been killing LeBron on the internet for this, and honestly, rightfully so. It was a very insensitive thing to say, especially when you are the face of the NBA and you are the ambassador of that league. And it follows a tradition of a problem the NBA has had for a few years now, which is players and former players of the NBA trashing their own product. Why would you spit on a team that is in the league that you are an ambassador for? Why would you besmirch and talk down on a city that has a team that is a part of the league, again, that you are an ambassador for? That's just bad for business. But in addition to being bad for business, it's a bad look because Memphis, Tennessee is the blackest city of all NBA cities that are part of the league. It's about 65% black. And it's a particularly soft subject for me because I grew up Jackson, Tennessee, about an hour away from Memphis. So, for me, growing up, Memphis was my big city. Memphis was my New York. And so I have a deep and fond affection and love for the city. And to hear the face of the NBA talking down about it, I personally didn't feel good about it. And I hate to see it because, one, it's a huge misuse of the NBA platform. And if we go back to 2020, there were all these NBA players that were, quote unquote, using their platform, but honestly, in good ways. You had guys like Malcolm Brogdon who were out in the middle of the George Floyd protests. LeBron himself stood on the ESPY stage with Dwayne Wade and Chris Paul and Carmelo Anthony, and, expressing their support for anti-racism and the importance of pushing back against anti-blackness. So there was a moment where it felt like NBA players in particular were committed to making statements and using their huge platforms to support the fight for social and economic justice for Black people in America. And then you hear this statement, the way LeBron is talking about a Black city, and it feels like we've done a complete 180. But the thing that I want to do is I also want to talk about even just what NBA teams mean to NBA cities, or really what the Grizzlies have meant to the city of Memphis, just empirically. So LeBron makes a comment that they should just move the city to Nashville. And the problem with that is that it undersells or it completely devalues what having an NBA team in Memphis has meant for the city of Memphis, and particularly for Black Memphians, and how, if anything, we should be talking about how the presence of the NBA team there needs to be stronger and they need to be doing even more. So, I love a graph. I put together this graph that shows a couple graphs. The first graph just shows, I tried to measure the economic impact of having an NBA team, but looking specifically at Memphis and Nashville. So I do kind of a center analysis where the focus is when the professional team arrived at the city and an income index over time. And as you can see, so the Predators arrived in Nashville in 1998. The Memphis Grizzlies arrived in Memphis in 2001. And you can see roughly similar positive impacts on the economies of those cities from literally just the arrival of the team. You're seeing a little bit higher of an economic impact in Nashville, but the trend lines are the same. I went a little bit deeper, and I wanted to look specifically, though, at differences across race, specifically looking at Black Nashvillians versus white Nashvillians, Black Memphians versus white Memphians. And that's where you start to see a pretty big difference. And so again, here's another graph where I'm just looking at poverty rates, because it was much easier to find this data. Poverty rates. And as you can see, poverty rate is going down for all four groups. But you're seeing both the biggest decline, but then also the biggest starting point from Black Memphians. So Black Memphians have benefited arguably the most from having the Memphis Grizzlies in Memphis. But at the same time, they were in the worst position to start in the early 2000s, late 1990s, before the team arrived. And so, again, this is saying we shouldn't be talking down on Memphis and pushing for the Grizzlies to leave the city. If anything, we should be trying to figure out how much of these changes can be attributed to the presence of the Grizzlies in the city of Memphis, and what can not only the Grizzlies, but really the NBA and all the dollars and attention that the NBA attracts, how can that be used to further increase the effectiveness of what we're seeing in these data trends, to actually do some real poverty alleviation in this city that has benefited from some already? And the answer to this is obvious and clear, because if you look at the cities that LeBron, I'm sure, would much rather spend a Thursday night in, probably here, a New York City, a Miami, maybe Chicago, those cities have one thing in common: tourism. The city he lives in now, tourism. The hotels are nicer. You know why? It's a function of tourism, right? When you have a strong tourism industry, you get more economic development. LA and New York are not LA and New York simply because of what happens in the city and what goes on financially and economically just within the city. These are mega cities that offer all these things because they attract people from around the country and around the world for tourism. You know what really could help Memphis right now? A major increase in tourism. You know what the NBA brings? Tourism. You know what LeBron's comments do to Memphis? They hurt the prospect of more tourism. And if anybody would understand the importance of tourism to Memphis, you would think it would be LeBron, who just 2 months ago rolled out a special edition LeBron sneaker honoring the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee, one of the biggest tourist attractions in the city. Never mind that you are selling $200 shoes to commemorate the death of Martin Luther King. Weird. But at the very least, it signals, or it draws us back to this idea that tourism really matters. So I hope that LeBron publicly apologizes for his remarks made about Memphis. But more than a public apology, I hope that he uses his time, his resources, his platform, his voice to help Memphis get more of what it needs, which is not only just a thriving tourism industry, but to be talked about and looked at with the kind of respect that the city deserves, given his contribution to music, Black music in particular, but music, to civil rights, to manufacturing, to logistics. There is so much innovation that has happened in Memphis, Tennessee. So many important American stories either started there or happened there. To talk about a city in this way, that's not leadership. Because again, what do I always say? What does good leadership do? Make the small feel tall. Make the small feel tall. And Memphis, Tennessee is a city of giants. But when we hear comments like the ones we just heard from LeBron, we treat the city of the people like ants. This is why, as I've been saying all episode, celebrities, we have to hold them accountable. We do. We have to hold them accountable. And that is this episode of Jonathan Thinks. Thank you to my producer, Mo, who's been working behind the scenes. Remember that every time we convene, it's an opportunity to grow. We do it with love. We do it with joy. We do it together. These were a few of my thoughts. And who knows, maybe you were thinking it too. In fact, let me know what you're thinking. Again, hit the comments. Hit me up on social media. Hit the comments on TikTok. Hit the comments on Instagram. Hit the comments on Facebook. I want to hear from you. And until next time, peace.